We are here with Dr. Laura Arnold Leibman, who is a professor at Reed College, professor of English, and author of several books. And we are so appreciative that you're joining us on Channeling Jewish History tonight.
Sure, my pleasure.
Okay, so I want to ask you a little bit about some of your work. You published a book previously. Your first book, I gather, was called The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, correct?
So I think that's like my 4th book, but sure, yes.
I'm sorry.
A recent book, yeah, sure.
Okay.
That's, okay.
That's your most recent one.
This is the power of the shadle. I'm old, but so I take it as a compliment that you thought it was my first book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry. What really intrigued me, I recently, as you know, interviewed the great Dr. Jonathan Sarna. We talked about early American Jewish history, colonial Jews, and in both the North and the South, and Charleston, New York in particular. And I was really intrigued by what happened to the early, well, Sephardic, which was the majority, the original Sephardic colonial Jews who settled in what was then the colonies. And what happened in terms of like where are the descendants today? Are there still Jewish descendants? Well, the story seems to be mixed. There are, of course, Jewish descendants, not many, but there are. And this brings me to your forthcoming book, am I correct? Which explores a very interesting kind of multiracial family, which is descendant of some of these Sephardic colonial settlers, as well as some of the early American slaves that were brought over. And they're proud of both of their heritages. And I'm really intrigued, I'm sure all my listeners will be, if you could tell us a little bit more about your forthcoming book, what it's about, and so on. So thank you.
So there's actually a chapter that's in the current book, which is about one of the women in that family. And basically I have years researching them. So I have a lot of material, and so they became their own book in addition. So they're a family that began their lives enslaved in Barbados. And I followed the history of a brother and sister pair where they were born in 1792 and 1798 respectively in Bridgetown, Barbados. And when they were very young, so in 1801, their father paid the owners of the enslaved children to free them, and they became free people of color on the island. And then when they were slightly older, they decided that they wanted to be officially members of the Jewish community. So they went to nearby Suriname, and then there had a halakhic conversion at the Portuguese synagogue. And after that, the brother returned to Barbados. The sister goes on to London, where she gets married at Bevis Marks. And then they both end up coming to New York eventually and becoming pretty important members of the New York Jewish community.
Very interesting. Now you see that kind of racial mix in other famous, there's another case, of course, Isaac Turo is one probably most famous. There is also in Amsterdam, the Curios. There's another interesting case that I came across in Lepika Pelham wrote a book on the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, and there were some cases of that, at least one that I came across that was very interesting. I don't know if you're aware, but there are a lot of, well, a significant number of people who don't identify as Jewish of various races who claim ancestry of Sephardic colonial settlers in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and of course in what is today the United States. What always, it has intrigued me, and quite disturbingly, Louis Farrakhan of all people claimed this ancestry on his father's side. He claimed that his father was a white Portuguese, Jewish ancestry. You have a very number of people spanning the range. You have a rapper, a Jamaican rapper, I believe, who's known as Sean Paul, has some Sephardic ancestry. You have, so it's very interesting to see how so many people kind of either embrace the ancestry and are proud of it, and how they kind of utilize this, because it's it's weighty. It seems to carry a lot. This ancestry, this Sephardic or Portuguese Jewish ancestry. What does it mean to these people?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that certainly during the time period that I work on, it's deemed much classier to be a Sephardic Jew than to be an Ashkenazi Jew. And that's pretty consistent across the colonies, that Sephardic Jews have more social cachet. Most of the synagogues are Sephardic by and large. So you'll get people like Mordecai Manuel Noah, like many of us, has 3 grandparents, only one of whom Sephardic. But when he talks about his ancestry, he talks about being Sephardic. He doesn't say, I'm 1/4 Sephardic. He says, I'm Sephardic, right? And we see this also other elite Ashkenazi families in the colonies, like the Gratzes. Their tombstones all look like Sephardic style tombstones, again, because it's classy, right? It's the kind of the thing. So I do think it's important that even when Sarah gets married, the woman that I'm working on, when she gets married to her husband, who's Joshua Moses, who's from a very wealthy family that's an Ashkenazi family that are members of Shereth Israel. When she gets married at Bevis Marks, it's right after Bevis Marks has just started allowing intermarriages between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews to take place in the synagogue. So at that time period, she has higher status than he does, right? So again, she converts Nassau, she identifies as Nassau, she's in the records as being Nassau, her father is Nassau, so of Portuguese ancestry, and that has weight during this time period. So definitely you see different notions of what it means to have social cachet within the Jewish world than maybe most people would think of in the United States today.
Right. That's fascinating. So this book is called Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Jewish Family. When is that scheduled to be out, do you know?
Actually, I hope next year. So it's come back from the readers, and I just need to have some revisions and then send it back to the publisher. So, everything's very slow in academic publishing, but we hope sometime next year. COVID obviously doesn't help.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so yeah, I want to kind of latch onto that point where you talk about how, people kind of co-opted in some cases the Sephardic identity because the Sephardim were the majority that had more social cachet, as you put it, and particularly interested in a lot of people. But let's talk a little bit about Chaim Solomon, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And Chaim Solomon, who, by the way, Dr. Sarna told me, very interestingly enough, has some direct descendants who are still Jewish and actively Jewish, actually, was born in Poland, Lesno, or Lisa, and according to some of the biographies, at least that's probably as a result of him kind of fashioning his own biography, as it were. His family was Sephardic even back in Poland. Have you ever come across anything like that?
Yeah, so honestly, those of us who work in Western Sephardic studies hear this all the time, that it's sort of a common thing that happens both in Poland and in Germany at this time, that you'll get Ashkenazi Jews claiming Sephardic legacy. And it's hard to know what exactly to do with that. I would say DNA ancestry is sort of fascinating on that level, because on the one hand, it sort of allows people to test that theory that many people have had. Even today, I'll meet people who have that idea in their families that their family was from Poland, but they're still Sephardi. And technically that seems unlikely, just given the number of Sephardim that were in Poland at the time compared to the number of people who claim Sephardic ancestry. One should be healthily skeptical, right? But I think it's interesting, as you said, that for Ashkenazi Jews, even outside of early America, that you're getting some of that interest, right? Like that there's something compelling to them about being part of that Sephardic story. And that for me is really interesting. And I think has some resonances with what's going on in the Southwest, though slightly differently. I mean, you hear something similar today in the Southwest that there'll be people who are descendants of conversos who are coming back to Judaism or have kept Judaism secretly. And I think, again, that there's a certain cachet towards Iberianness within Latin American and Hispanic communities. But in that instance, it actually is quite likely, right? Like they're statistically, I would say they're more likely to have been descendants of conversos than people in who were living in Poland in the 18th century. So yes, I think it's an interesting topic, and DNA sort of opens up new routes for people to kind of confirm or disprove family stories that they have rumbling in the background.
Yeah, it's definitely true. DNA hopefully will solve a lot of these questions and dispel some of these myths. That's likely to happen eventually. I've been actually, obviously you probably know I've been dealing a lot specifically with this claim of Eastern European Jews who claim Sephardic ancestry, and I've found out so many new fascinating things about that, but it's something for a different show. Back to Chaim Solomon. Stephen Birmingham in his the Grandees was obviously not a very accurate, historically accurate book, but it's one of the early books that discussed Sephardic Jews in North America, and he claimed that the quote-unquote waspy Sephardim of New York and of Philadelphia initially refused to accept Solomon as one of their own, even though he had become a member of both She'erit Israel in New York and later Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. It was only after a statue was erected in his honor in Philadelphia that featured him alongside George Washington that they proudly pointed to him as one of their own, which is, I found really interesting. And it ties into what we're going to discuss soon about patriotism.
Yeah, so I would say that whole claim of the waspy Western Sephardim seems to be like, I would just say like total Ashkenazi bias about like what counts as being rigorous, and maybe a little bit of a backlash. We sometimes see this in the colonies of like the Sephardic Jews are like, oh, the new Ashkenazi immigrants are so tacky and so this and that. And you'll see a bit of backlash coming back from the Ashkenazi immigrants. And so I would take the waspy comment to be sort of part and parcel of that sort of issue, that Western Sephardic Jews obviously have their own traditions and are very different and have a different relationship to secular culture than a lot of Ashkenazi immigrants, even in the colonial period. But to call them waspy just seems wrong, right? So I guess I take some problems with that. I haven't seen anything about this Chaim Solomon being sort of at the outskirts of the community before. I have to say I don't work particularly on him, so maybe I've missed something, but I've never seen anything that suggested like, certainly very high-up members of both She'erit Israel and of Mikveh Israel are Ashkenazi Jews, including Joshua Moses' father as the Parnas at various points. And so it just doesn't fit with the communities at the time. If you look at Suriname, where there's this huge Jewish community, and there is an Ashkenazi synagogue very early on and a Sephardic one, you definitely do see the Sephardim saying, I don't want intermarriage with the Ashkenazi Jews, and I don't want them to be members of the congregation. You just don't see that early on in She'erit Israel and Mikveh Israel. They're very different kinds of communities. So it seems like, I'm not sure I buy that argument, but.
I hear it. Yeah, I mean, Chaim Solomon is just a fascinating figure, and I think not as well known as he should be. His son, I think, less famously so, who I think was named after him because he actually was born right after he passed away. I mean, obviously, 9 months after, something along those lines. And he was. He filed a lawsuit claiming that the U.S. government owed the family money, the money that his father had lent to the Continental Army, and then he claimed that I'm not doing it for the money. I just want recognition, and the federal government then erected a statue of Chaim Salomon, along with some other gestures that were done in his honor that I thought was really, really fascinating and interesting. But the family was acculturated Sephardi. As you say, there were many Ashkenazi Jews who acculturated within the majority community, and that wasn't really an issue. Maybe it wasn't an issue, certainly in the second generation. I mean, Emma Lazarus, I mean, you can probably go through the whole list. They all had Ashkenazi ancestry. Yet, interestingly enough, they don't often point to that Ashkenazi. Mordechai Meni Noach, they don't point to.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly what I mean, is that for New York and Philadelphia, it's really hard to find a Sephardic family that doesn't have blood, had Ashkenazi ancestor that nobody's mentioning, right? So the families are just completely intertwined. But again, I think your point is exactly right, that when you ask them what they are, they say that they're Sephardic, right? Because that's what's seen as being part of the elite, right? And by 1830s, 1840s, they're trying to distinguish themselves from the new generation of people coming in who are not as Americanized and not as wealthy, and or even if they're certainly poor members of the Sephardic community, are not part of that old guard, right? So it's just a sort of general story that we see throughout American Jewish history of people who are already here sort of distance themselves oftentimes from recent immigrants.
Right. Newcomers always have a hard time anywhere, everywhere. I mean, even Sephardic, and I mentioned that in the Sarna interview, the Eastern Sephardic Jews who came from the Balkan Peninsula, from the crumbling Ottoman Empire at the time, were not exactly warmly embraced by Sheretz Israel when they first arrived in New York. Rabbi the Solopoul, I believe it was, said, yes, these are the descendants, our brethren who, came directly from the Iberian Peninsula. But he actually said, let's give them some time to acculturate and kind of get more civilized, something along those lines, where, because the mentality and the customs were different between Western, the language, the culture was different between, the Eastern and the Western. Eventually, of course, they were absorbed, and they were, they got leadership positions, and, some of the rabbis were of Eastern Sephardic lineage, including the recent one, the one before the present one, Rabbi Mark Angel, of course, is of Rhodesian ancestry. But it's interesting. And what you say is absolutely true, that every wave of new immigrants had a hard time, and then the ones that were already acculturated and Americanized kind of looked down on them. Hey, these greenhorns, they're, they're kind of primitive, and, we don't want the non-Jews to associate us with these, these guys who are not as acculturated and as civilized as we are. So this is, to this day, I mean, this is an issue, and not just among Jews. It's just a human behavior, I think. Right. So what else can you tell me about Jews? Let's backtrack a little bit. Who, in the colonial period, right before the revolution, you had the Seixas family, fascinating Seixas family, or Rabbi Gershom Mendes Seixas, who shut down the synagogue on the eve of the war, right before the war, because he shut down the synagogue and he moved to Newport. Is that correct?
Philadelphia. Yeah. So
Philadelphia
to escape the incoming British Army, and is helpful in terms of getting Mikveh Israel really established during that time period. That pretty much the entire New York Jewish community, I don't know which direction it would be, moves from New York to Philadelphia, and has sort of a setup in exile, which becomes Mikveh Israel, or helps establish Mikveh Israel. Yeah.
And then the Seixas family is very interesting. I mean, and so many prominent American families are descendant of the Seixases. I found it fascinating that the Sulzberger family, including the Sulzberger of the New York Times, are descendants of Rabbi Gershom's brother, who was himself one of the founders of Wall Street. He founded the stock market. So this was a very prominent Jewish family that gave rise to a lot of families that are both Jewish and non-Jewish to the present day. We're aware of this. I wonder the Sulzbergers are proud of that fact. I mean, they're also German, obviously.
Yeah. So yeah,
And
I mean, even the family that I was telling you about originally, who had began their lives in Barbados, that they're the sister of the two siblings, Sarah, Brandon, Moses. One of her sons marries Gershom Anastasius's granddaughter. So those family lines also become combined. And again, it's sort of a good moment for both families in terms of reinforcing insiderness and whatnot. So
yeah,
absolutely.
kind of like
Yeah,
royalty.
I'm a
Yeah.
lot of Gershom Anastasius right now because I'm working on yellow fever in timely. So I've been working this summer. My project has been mainly on two different yellow fever epidemics, one in the 1790s and then another in the 1820s. And Gershom Anastasius, a lot of his early sermons are in response to yellow fever epidemics, which I have to say before COVID hit, I hadn't really paid that much attention to his sermons that I actually love rabbinical sermons. I'm like one of those like ideal congregants. And then I'm like, oh, what did the rabbi say today? I'm so excited. But for some reason, Gershom Anastasius's sermons had never really done much for me. Like, what is this Thanksgiving sermon? So a lot of his sermons are these Thanksgivings where everybody in New York gets together and says, we're going to declare this communal day of Thanksgiving across denominations for people having survived the yellow fever epidemic, because typically about 10% of the city would die during an epidemic. So it's just brutal. And so it's a really interesting example of, um, you think you've studied stuff a lot and you know what's going on, and then suddenly something happens in your own world that makes you pay attention to different things. And suddenly I was like, oh my gosh, he's talking about yellow fever. He's talking about epidemics, and he's trying to console people after these horrific losses during these early epidemics. So yeah, I've been sort of obsessing over Gershom Anastasius, and then his sister, Grace Anastasius, who marries one of the Nathans, Simon Nathan, and writes a bunch of early poetry. She actually also writes poetry about the early epidemics too. So I've been very interested in both of them about how they're responding to the tragedies that are going on.
Yep. Yep. There's a lot of interesting aspects to explore there.
Yeah.
Some of the other interesting characters that appear in the that period, Solomon Nunes Carvalho, who's a observant Jew, joins 1817. This is not not exactly that period. A little after that.
Yeah.
He's an observant Jew. He's out in Charleston, South Carolina, which actually becomes, which at that time is still the largest Jewish community. It's a port city. It's hard for people to believe that it wasn't New York. It was actually the South.
Yeah.
Port City in the South was the largest Jewish community in the United States at the time. And then you have these interesting characters in Charleston, South Carolina, coming out of Charleston. You have Solomon Nunes Carvalho, who's a skilled photographer. He joins the famous John Fremont on the trail. And he's an observant Jew. He strictly observes kashrut, dietary laws. And it's just fascinating. He's completely acculturated, a big patriot, loves the country, but is also active in his community, in his synagogue. Right?
Yeah. So Carvalho is somebody who I'm super interested in part because his father's from Barbados. So his father was the Hazan in Barbados before he comes to the United States. And this is sort of one of the many connections that I'm sort of interested in between what's going on in the West Indies, which have much, much larger Jewish communities than the United States at this point, and the northern communities. But Carvalho is super interesting, that he is a really important artist. And I think your point about he's an observant Jew is an important one, because I know somebody who responded to my book was like, oh, I wish that she had talked more about Orthodox women. I was like, so all the women I talk about are Orthodox because it's before the rise of the Reform movement, right? So I may not have said, like, by the way, they're Orthodox, because there's not really this category of Orthodox in the United States. Everybody falls under that category. So But I think within that, you certainly see levels of observance. And he is somebody whose father was a Hazan. He's somebody who is very interested in the Jewish community. And he goes on this incredible voyage that he's really part of this moment where people are making these daguerreotypes, which are so hard to make. Like, it's incredible that he schleps all of his equipment across the Rockies, and then he manages to bring back these very fragile glass plates. So each daguerreotypes are different than modern photos, that each one of them is distinctive. You don't have any negatives to make copies off of. So if you break that plate, you get the plate, right? So, so he drags them back. A bunch of people die on the journey, and it's a miracle that he survives, let alone brings back these incredible pictures, which become part of the Fremont expedition's illustrations for the different books. Fremont owns the pictures because he paid for it. So he uses them as a promo materials when he's running, I think, for president at the time. And unfortunately, Fremont has them and he puts them in a warehouse in New York that then catches on fire and they almost all are destroyed. So it's not because they don't make it back on the journey, but they're just lost in this random fire in the 19th century. So we have just, I think, one or two left from that journey, plus the illustrations that were based on them. But Carvalho is such an interesting figure. He's also a portrait artist. So we have some portraits of his wife that are really charming. Um, so he's a very interesting figure. We don't have that many artist figures from this time period who are Jewish, and he's such a, it's hard to imagine like the things that he went through in order to be part of this American journey.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Orthodoxy and Reform because staying in Charleston for a minute, let's talk about the family of Judah P. Benjamin. Judah P. Benjamin, of course, is an entire subject in of itself, but let's talk about, his father Philip, who was born in 1779. They came over from the Danish West Indies, and settled in Charleston. And Philip Benjamin became a member of the congregation Beth Elohim in Charleston, which is one of the oldest, certainly in the South. And what happens in, I believe it was in the no, it's way before that. There was a breakaway, and I don't recall exactly what year it was, the Reformed Society of Israelites break away from this, I guess, what we would call Orthodox, although among the Western Spartan there was no such concept as Orthodox. The regular, mainstream, observant synagogue, Beth Elohim, has kind of a mutiny in a sense. And the people, a group of people, which include Judah Benjamin's father, interestingly enough, form this breakaway, which eventually it disintegrates and then they reintegrate, but that kind of sets in I'm sorry, that was 1824. My apologies. It's 1824. So I know it's before the Civil War. Okay. In 1824 is when the members who want a more liberal, more Americanized, more Western, shorter prayers, a lot of the things that we see happen in the Reform Synagogue in Hamburg, to consider more, Reform, classical Reform. So his father is obviously part of that group. And so Judah grows up with a kind of more, ironically in a way, kind of liberal mindset. And Charleston is still referred to as, I think, the cradle of Reform Judaism in America.
Totally. Yeah.
Right?
And I think Charleston is such an interesting case. And I think back to your earlier point that people tend to forget about Charleston. And I don't work a ton on Charleston, so I will put that out there. But Charleston in the 1820s, you see this early Reform congregation, and it's really not until the 1840s that you start to see that in New York, for example. So much, much earlier in Charleston than in the Northeast, further north at least. So that I think is super important, and really important that it's not coming out of where we might expect, which is where it comes in New York, out of a German Reform tradition from Europe, but is this breakaway from the Portuguese Reform. And I will say, I think that Rabbi Sholem Morris, at one point at least, was going to be writing on this, and I hope that he still does. But there's definitely an interesting story to be told there when you think about the larger Portuguese Sephardic world, because certainly another early Reform congregation breaks away in Curacao, which has the biggest Jewish community for a very long time. And I know when I used to live in Panama, which is largely, the community is by and large Sephardic. It's 95% Sephardic, but the old Sephardic there's the new Sephardic and the old Sephardic. And the new Sephardic is all Syrian and is very Machmir and very like Orthodox, like super strict. And the old Sephardic are all the Portuguese Sephardim. It's the original early congregation, and they're Reform. So there's Reformed Sephardic and Orthodox Sephardic, just like there would have been at one point for Curacao. So now Curacao also has Reform Sephardic, but they have Orthodox Ashkenazi congregations. So very different. But I would say those are sort of three good examples of not the story we normally think about with respect to the Reform movement, where we think of it as something coming out of Germany, coming to the Upper East Coast, going into Cincinnati, and then like spreads across the United States. A very different sort of version of it. And again, I know Rabbi Morris, who's at Baptist Marxist, talked about writing about this, and I hope that he does. I don't know a ton about it, but I throw it out there.
I certainly hope as well. I think we need a lot more written about this period. I don't think it's enough well known. I was recently reading Eli Evans, who's the great writer in the South. He wrote a biography of Judah P. Benjamin, also his own memoirs of living in the South. And the Jews in the South, I mean, to this day, have kind of like this ambivalent, kind of torn relationship with some of these figures that were prominent during the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, of course. Yeah. And today, it's a sensitive topic, especially these days. Would you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's. I don't know if you were following, but there was an incident recently where, strangely, in San Francisco, there were stained glass windows, I think, in one of the congregations that included a picture of Judah Benjamin. And so there's this question of what to do about this legacy of Judah Benjamin, who I would say has become reasonably problematic, as with all these sort of Confederacy heroes. Like, why are we still worshiping Confederate heroes who were rebels against the country that we're in, right? So I think it speaks to the sort of divided legacy that never fully got dealt with in a lot of ways. But interesting that somebody else was remarking to me when he was a kid that there were still, you would get these stories about Judah Benjamin to read in terms of school and whatnot as a Jewish hero. And I think for us today that seems odd, because Judah Benjamin, again, is on the side of the Confederacy and clearly does some things that most of us would find troubling at best. So interesting, right? That I think there is this sort of ebb and flow of like, what does it mean for somebody to be a Jewish hero or heroine from the past, and what are the values that we want to uphold? And when we go looking back towards the colonial period, part of where we put our focus is what stories resonate for me today and make sense for me about what it meant to be a Jew then, but also help me understand the sort of longer legacy of Jews in the Americas. And maybe Benjamin's falling a little bit out of favor. There's an interesting novel by Dara Horn where she talks about Judah Benjamin too, and is much more about the sort of legacy of slavery and whatnot. So he's definitely somebody I think that will continue to become a sort of trouble spot for people going forward. He's not somebody, because I don't really work that much on the South, I don't know a ton about him. But I do think that question about who we look to for the stories that we want to tell is really important. That I know that, this is sort of a sidetrack, but one of the things that I was doing before COVID hit was sort of workshops for mainly middle school girls for Jewish day schools about trying to have an interactivity where they could learn more about Jewish women, particularly Orthodox women, because I was mainly Orthodox day schools, about from the colonial period. And I think for those of us who grew up like not hearing those stories, that's really important, right? To remember, oh, women, we contribute to Jewish history too, and our stories are complicated, and there's all sorts of women who are involved. And what were women adding to that moment in time? Certainly, Emma Lazarus gets plenty of uh, air time, but who are some other people too?
Yeah, so many other people are so much less known. Absolutely, absolutely, I agree more. Yeah, there was something. Yeah, I now remember something I wanted to say. I don't know if you've probably read Philip Roth, The Plot Against America. I'm guessing, or
Oh, you're
maybe you
cutting
watched
out a
the
little bit for me.
rendering of The Plot Against America. There's a great scene in there. Sorry. Have you had a chance to read Philip Roth's The Plot Against America?
No, I
No,
haven't. So I've heard I should.
oh, you haven't.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's
kind of a
HBO
love-hate
also.
thing.
Yeah.
I have kind of a love-hate thing with Philip Roth. So he's an amazing writer,
Yeah.
but he's also like so irritating to me on some level. So I sort of go through these moments where I'm like, I really like Philip Roth, and then other times where I'm like, Philip Roth's driving me crazy or whatever. So yeah, so there are plenty of things and because I mainly work on the early period, I haven't necessarily read everything that Philip Roth has ever written. So
I'm not. Spoiler alert, it's not really a huge part of the plot. There is a scene in there where a rabbi who's pro, I guess this anti-Semitic candidate, everybody who thinks it's the anti-Semitic candidate, who's asked about Judah Benjamin, and it's just an interesting scene about how he says, yeah, you're right, the South, the Pharisee were betraying you and was unjust. But let's remember that the second most powerful man in the Confederate South was a Jew, in fact. So they certainly weren't anti-Semitic. In fact, if you want to find anti-Semitism, well, he didn't say that, but there was plenty of anti-Semitism in the North. Grant, of course, issued his infamous order expelling Jews after Lincoln got involved. That's a whole different story. Anyway, but it was just a fascinating. I actually was listening to the director's cut, and it was basically taken word for word from a conversation that he had with some Jews in the South who kind of viewed Judah Benjamin in that very way. As yes, the cause was unjust. At the same time, like I said, there's this kind of mixed emotions, I guess. Because he was one of our own. He was a war hero, and in the South, people kind of view these people to this day differently than most people in the North view these people. And the North-South divide, as you probably know, still exists. It didn't magically dissipate the day after the Civil War in mathematics, right? So it's just a fascinating concept.
Yeah, I think for me that this sort of gets at the heart of some of the issues. Ooh, this is a heavy topic, but I would say like this, I think is kind of that intersection of like, it's so hard of what are our ethical responsibilities in terms of choosing heroes, right? Like, do I want to pick people with whom everything they ever did was good, or do I want to ignore the things that they did that were bad, or do I want to say like, I like these things, but these things not quite making it, right? And so for me, at least, I'm not sure that anybody would fall into that like always perfect camp, because we know that even from the Torah, right? Like some of the Torah figures also like have these moments.
Exactly.
Moses kills somebody, right?
Well,
So it doesn't make it into the promised land as a result. So I think for me, it's that moment of saying, okay, these things are things I admire, and these are things that I don't admire. We're all complicated, but we all strive, right? So like, what is that moment of what we're looking for from the past? And for me, at least being honest about it is good stuff. So that would be my thought, is like, maybe going back and looking at the childhood stories of Benjamin and thinking, where did they not want to talk about certain things. And so that just got left out of the picture. And maybe that's not the way to go either in terms of thinking about Jews' responsibility in terms of creating a better future for the country, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Absolutely. And I personally don't believe in shoving things that are unpleasant under the rug. And I think it's important to talk about things, warts and all, especially if you want to be an honest historian. I think it's important to talk about things that are uncomfortable and maybe don't make us look great. But hey, that's humanity. That's history. People are complicated. They're multidimensional. They're not all evil or all good. And yeah, I was thinking, in the Bible, you have highly flawed individuals who are looked at as very righteous people because they owned up to, usually because they owned up to what they did.
Totally.
But at the same time, you have a lot of dimensions. Okay, that's a whole separate subject that we can talk about some other time.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot of changes that happened after the Civil War. The South loses, and Charleston by then, loses a lot of its luster. The Jewish community, of course, in the South in general, becomes smaller, shrinks. The centers of the communities move towards the north. Many of the Jews that remain eventually assimilate and intermarry, if not most of them, I think. So by the time Eli Evans does research in the South, he's able to find one descendant of one of the original colonial Jewish families that still remain in Charleston, the only one. I don't know if you've ever come across them, that's the Tobias family, Thomas Jefferson Tobias.
Oh, that's
fascinating guy. And
I
yeah,
silhouettes of the Tobias family. Ooh, the Tobias family. There's a cute silhouette to them when they're visiting Saratoga Springs. So. Yeah, I mean,
really?
I think that's very different than the North in a lot of ways. In that, if I don't know how often you ever go to Spanish Portuguese congregations, but pretty much any time I've ever been to a Spanish Portuguese congregation anywhere, there's people there who are descendants of early members of the congregation. And that's true when I've been in the Caribbean, it's true when I've been in London and Amsterdam and New York and Philadelphia, like pretty much everywhere I've ever gone, that's the case, that those congregations, people tend to stick with them. And I don't think that, obviously some people have drifted away, but that's true pretty much everywhere. So, yeah, I don't know. So that's interesting that he was finding that in Charleston. I don't know what the story is there. Intriguing. I wonder if it has partially to do with that split in the congregation.
Right. So we have the Sephardic Jews in North America are kind of overpowered by the more recent arrivals from the Eastern Sephardic countries and from Arab lands. So yeah, the Western Sephardic community, probably not just in the United States, kind of feels, I think some of the people that I've associated kind of feels kind of threatened that their tradition becomes overwhelmed and lost. And so there's this kind of struggle to preserve the preservation of the Western Sephardic tradition. And it's just an interesting phenomenon to look into, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly since I'm on the West Coast, both Portland, where I live now, and Seattle, where my husband's from, they were very big centers for Sephardic Jews pretty early on in their histories and continue to be today, but they're Eastern Sephardic communities, right? So we did 100-year anniversary recently of the Sephardic community in Portland, but it's an Eastern Sephardic tradition, and they had asked me to help out with the putting together the materials for it, which I did, but I had to explain, like, I work on Western Sephardic Jews. It's a completely different thing, right? Like, it's not that I know nothing about Eastern Sephardic traditions. It's just they're different communities, right? There's some overlap, but some pretty big differences too. So, yeah, totally. There are some interesting items. I don't know if you've ever seen the collection that was put together by Julia Cohen Phillips and Sarah Stein on Sephardic Jews. And it's a collection of primary sources. And they have some really beautiful sources that are about during that Great Migration period, so the 1880s to 1920s, when you get a huge waves of Sephardic Jews from Eastern Sephardic Jews into New York, and people from Shearith Israel helping out people, recent immigrants. So you do see that sort of connections that Shearith Israel recognizes Eastern Sephardim as being part of that larger group. So kinsmen in a way.
Yeah, fascinating. Absolutely, very fascinating. Okay, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation, Dr. Leibman. I really hope to have you on again after your book is released, hopefully sooner rather than later, and there's no extra delays. It's a fascinating subject, and I think it deserves a lot of attention.
Thank you so
I
much.
appreciate you
Thanks for
coming
having
on. Absolutely. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Sure. Good luck with everything.